welcome for the third stage of this journey in which we visit the city of Geneva and we explore in particular the history of Geneva before the Reformation. In our last stage, we walked along Rue Adhémar-Fabry, near the Jardin des Alpes, the Garden of the Alps, that is, and discovered the great influence the bishop honored in that street had to the history of Geneva. So the bishop, of course, was Adhémar-Fabry. But for this stage, we are not going too far from here. In fact, we will visit a street which starts only 50 meters away from Rue Adhémar-Fabry. And the street in question is named Rue François Bonivard. It is actually in this street that the Anglican Church Église Anglaise de Genève is located. And there would be much to say about the Anglican Church, for example, that it was built in the Gothic Revival architectural style in 1853. But however, as you know, since we are looking for traces of what God did in Geneva before the Reformation, we will leave the church for now. And our focus will rather be, as in our last stage, on the name of the street itself. So the street is named after a man named François Bonivard. And François Bonivard is in fact a very interesting figure, because he was a man who lived both at the end of the era preceding the Reformation, as well as during the first decades following its adoption in Geneva. But before we discover who François Bonivard was, we need to try to grasp the climate in which the city was engulfed during his lifetime. For several centuries, the influence of the southern neighbor, the Duchy of Savoy, had ever been increasing over Geneva, which struggled to maintain its independence. And in the days of Bonivard's lifetime, the Duke of Savoy, Charles II, was now trying to finally incorporate the city into his realm. In Geneva, a substantial part of the citizens supported, actually, the endeavors of the House of Savoy. Others, however, fought for the independence of the city and sought an alliance with the Swiss Confederation, which had begun to gather several free Swiss cantons together nearly 2 centuries earlier. And so, as we can imagine, the climate in Geneva was rather tense. So let us now turn to the life of François Bonivard, and let us look at how he influenced the history of the city. The Bonivard family was of a noble and ancient line. François was born in Seyssel, that is in Savoy, in modern-day France, in 1493, and spent part of his childhood at the priory of Saint-Victor, the most important monastery in Geneva, where he was raised by his uncle Jean Amet, who was also the prior of the monastery. While being of a high birth allowed him to study in renowned Christian institutions, such as grammar at the Abbey of Pinerolo in Italy, and law at Freiburg in Bresgau, that is in modern-day Germany. And there he also learned German, a language that will be extremely useful for his future missions. In 1510, François Bonivard was appointed prior of Saint-Victor to replace his retiring uncle, who would die 4 years later. His new role did not stop Bonivard to pursue his studies, this time in Turin, where he met Philibert Berthelier, the leader of the Independence Party of Geneva, whom we will discover in a later stage. This meeting led him to side with the independentists, and thanks to his language skills, Bonivard became a key spokesman on behalf of Geneva's Independence Party to the German-speaking Swiss cantons. Well, his key role for the independentists will cause him, as we can imagine, opposition from the supporters of the House of Savoy. A turning point in the crisis with the House of Savoy was the arrest and execution of Philibert Berthelier in 1519 by the pro-Savoy rulers of Geneva. And so, as we can imagine, the situation was quite precarious for Bonivard, and soon after that, he was also arrested. But instead of weakening the movement for independence, these events actually stirred up the people of Geneva. And finally, thanks to rising pressures for his liberation, Bonivard was released. Nevertheless, François Bonivard could not recover his priory as it had been in the meantime given to the city's hospitals. Well, his freedom remained, however, precarious, and being a too dangerous figure for the independence of Geneva, he was again arrested in 1530 and sent to Château Chillon, a castle on an island at the other end of Lake Geneva near Montreux, a land that was then under the control of the House of Savoy. But once again Bonivard was released, this time thanks to the invasion of the Bernese army. And finally he returned to Geneva, which had finally succeeded in pushing back the House of Savoy and where the Reformation had now begun. Well, while his contribution as a spokesman for the independence of Geneva had been crucial, there is another lasting influence that Bonivard would have over the city, namely his literary works. After the independence of Geneva and its adoption of the Reformation, Bonivard left the monastic life, adopted the Reformed faith, and got married. However, even in his new life, Bonivard still remained a scholar. And then the city council asked him to write the Chronicles of Geneva, which would be the first extensive work on the history of the city. This task had first been given to a man named Ami Porral, but he died before even starting it. So in order to reach his objective, Bonivard studied several other similar types of works, such as the Chronicles of Johannes Stumpf, who was a Reformed theologian and one of the first writers of Swiss history. While the Chronicles of Geneva became his most important work, Bonivard published other fascinating works in many different fields. Among them were a treatise of philology called Advis et Devis des langues, that is, Notice and Description of Languages. Also a theological treatise called Amartigene, that is, On the Source of Sin, and the legal history of Geneva called Traité de l'Ancienne et de la Nouvelle Police, in English, Treaty of the Old and New Policy. All these works reveal Bonivard's particular concern for writing history. And even though the accuracy of his works was criticized by later scholars, the biblical worldview according to which François Bonivard understood the world is particularly evident in his writings. He understood that time and history were subjected to the providence of God. François Bonivard's biblical worldview made him also particularly concerned with truth. And this led him not only to criticize the popes of his time, but also some of the rulers who had superficially endorsed the Reformation, such as, for example, Henry VIII, the King of England, whom he called, with the other rulers who had adopted superficially the Reformation, difformes réformateurs in French, that is, deformed reformers. Moreover, in Advis et Devis de mensonges, that is, in English, Notice and Description of Lie, Bonivard dealt with the poets, historians, painters, and inventors of superstition of his time, and lamented that very few people told the truth constantly. So, all of this to say that through François Bonivard, we can also see how God raised scholars to record history, just as he did in ancient Israel, so that future generations would know what he had done in the past, and also how men obeyed or rebelled against him. I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next week for another stage of European Journeys.